walk before thee with steadfast purpose and a single heart, and faithfully serve in their several offices. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Let's recite the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
The Senate is in session.
Messages from Her Excellency, the President.
I've received the following communication from the President of Barbados. Dear Mr. President, I shall be away from the island on duty leave during the period 3rd to 5th February 2023. In accordance with the provisions of Section 33 of the Constitution, the Very Reverend Dr. Jeffrey Douglas Gibson will perform the functions of the office of President during my absence. As the Honorable Senate will not be meeting prior to my departure, it will not be possible for the usual formal message to be sent to your chamber. Will you therefore please bring my absence formally to the attention of the Honorable Senate when next it meets? Yours faithfully, signed by the President of Barbados.
Announcements by Your Honor, the President.
I have received for confirmation minutes of our meetings held on Wednesday, January 25th, 2023, and Wednesday, February 1st, 2023. Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'd like to move the confirmation of the minutes of the meeting on Wednesday, January 25th, 2023, and Wednesday, February 1st to be confirmed.
The question is that those minutes be confirmed. Honorable Senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. Those minutes stand confirmed. In terms of further announcements, I have apologies for absence today from Senator Walcott. He is servicing that World Health Organization antimicrobial committee today. And indications of late arrival from Senator Maynard. Those are the only announcements for today.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers, reports from select committees, questions to ministers, requests for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance, statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries, personal explanations, motions relating to the business or sins of the Senate moved by minister, introduction of bills.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to give notice of the following bills: the Value Added Tax Amendment Bill 2023 and the Minor Offences Amendment Bill 2023. Mr. President, I also beg to move the first reading of the aforementioned bills, the Value Added Tax Amendment Bill of 2023 and the Minor Offences Amendment Bill of 2023.
The question is that the Value Added Tax Amendment Bill 2023 and the Minor Offences Amendment Bill 2023 be read the first time. Honourable Senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Private members' business.
Private members' business.
Order number 1, sir. in the name of Senator Dr. the Honorable C.W. Brathwaite to resume the debate on the passing of a resolution that in light of the global food crisis, that Barbados develop an integrated food security plan which will inter alia reposition the agricultural sector, and that the plan informed by the Agricultural Development Vision of 2012 be reduced to a development document and made available to the Senate.
Senator Malibu.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to lend my support to this resolution from Senator Brathwaite. I don't think anyone would deny the importance of what has been stated in this resolution, especially coming on the heels of what has been the global disruption in logistics, in production, in finance, and recognizing Barbados's unique position in the world, being able to be self-sufficient, even if that is not attainable, but to aim for it, that perhaps we could be, in some ways, at least partially self-sufficient in our food production. I would support that. What I would like to do, Mr. President, though, is to limit my comments into the area where perhaps I can assist or have some, perhaps some knowledge. And I would like to frame those comments by looking at this resolution and what it would entail to achieve the ultimate goal of the resolution. It's very complex. And I want to look at my comments, Mr. President, within the areas of the environment that we actually have to deal with in Barbados, the skills, the labor, the capital, the marketplace, and finally, the land use policy. So let me address it from that angle. First of all, let's start with the environment. The reality is that the environment in Barbados, we live on a tropical island of a very small size. There is all kinds of competing needs for our land. We have a certain amount of rainfall. Global warming is perhaps changing that. We have certain soil conditions. That's the macro environment that we live in. Mr. President, on the micro environment, though, there are, as I travel around Barbados and as I see within my own business of real estate, there's all kinds of micro environments. There's some land that is suitable for production. It might be flat and good soil and has water. There may be other areas where the soil type across Barbados is vastly different, from the sandy soil on our shores to the deep, rich, productive soil in parts of the inland. So whatever policy is informed must be informed by the environment that we have, which in many respects God gave us and we can't change. We can affect it, but perhaps we can't on a macro level change it. With regards to the skills aspect that will be needed to achieve the aims of this resolution, I heard the comments of learned Senator Brathwaite with regards to the output of educated agriculture degree people from the University of the West Indies. I was absolutely astounded to learn that we only have so few are choosing this as a career, choosing it as a place of learning, choosing to aspire to that. But perhaps that is a chicken and egg situation, because generally speaking, people will choose a passion, a calling, a career based upon what they see, where they can be successful, where an industry lies. So perhaps it is that, not that because we don't produce people with that education, we don't have the industry. It's because we don't have the industry that no one chooses to get educated in that industry. It's a vicious cycle that we see in many other places. I heard, turning now to labor, I heard Deputy President Senator Thompson speak of the cultural divide, maybe, that seems to exist, or the stigma that we have left over from working in the fields. And while I'm no expert on this, I've heard this my whole life, I'm not sure that the evidence supports such. And why I say that is because I see rejoicing and celebration often when Barbadians are chosen to work on the Canadian Farm Programme. It's not that we don't want to work in agriculture, maybe the conditions of work that are here in Barbados don't suit it. I also see other people from neighboring islands who choose to work in agriculture. They see it differently to how we see it. So again, I worry that it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. So I think that there perhaps are other reasons why our people don't aspire to work within the agriculture sector. And maybe those other reasons will come out in a few other comments I make. I want to comment about the policy to be self-sufficient in food production with regards to capital flow to this business. Capital flow is not different to any other flow that relies on some form of gravity, let's call it that. Capital flows to where there is a good return. And if there is not sufficient return within the agriculture sector, there will be no capital invested in it. But the one thing with capital is that we can artificially influence it. We can't artificially influence, I don't think, the amount of rainfall that we have, or perhaps the soil that we have. We can keep it, we can preserve it, we can stop it from running away. But capital, we can influence where that money flows. And we do that in many ways in different places. And that leads me on to the marketplace that we need to create for agriculture, Mr. President. And I mean by the marketplace, the incentives, the taxation, the policies that surround the agriculture business. You know, I have seen us protect or encourage various industries in Barbados. And there's no doubt that for successive governments, they have tried to protect and incentivize agriculture. The evidence demonstrates to us that it has not worked perfectly. Certainly my understanding is that we subsidize sugar production for good reasons to some extent. But if we look at other industries that have been protected, I would comment on three and ask whether or not we have offered to our agriculture sector, our food production sector, the same level of focus, the same level of urgency. Fast food. I have watched for years, and it has changed in the last 10 years, but for the 30 years prior to that, I've watched a protectionist approach to that. We kept foreign franchises out, whatever. And we did develop an excellent locally grown fast food business. I watched the garment industry, which we protect through taxation, through incentives, through various things. I work at the furniture industry. And all I ask this chamber, all I ask, Mr. President, is to consider, have we really thought about how important food security is to us in setting policy that will allow capital to flow to that industry such that we could achieve the objectives? We have done it in other industries. Have we done it in agriculture? I'll turn to one last area which I mentioned, which is the land use policy. I have spoken on this outside of this chamber in my private capacity on a number of occasions, and perhaps this is one area where I do have some expertise. Our land use policy, which is encompassed in the physical development plan, needs to recognize the competing uses for our land. If you find a piece of land that's on a white sand beach with calm Caribbean waters, chances are the highest and best use of that land is a hotel. On the other hand, if you find some flat land with great soil and easy access to water, chances are we should be keeping that for agriculture. But if we drive around Barbados, as much as that physical development plan informs us, and it's a great plan, I worry that in fact the implementation of it has been different to what the plan says. Putting small housing areas into small areas within large plantation land does not lend itself to the efficiency that is needed for successful agriculture. We need to be very careful with our land use policy. The other thing that worries me, and I don't have specific statistics at my fingertips, but I can give you anecdotal information from my area of practice, that somewhere, Mr. President, in the region of 10 to 20% of all residential land is today vacant in Barbados, is vacant. It is designated residential. It's maybe subdivided into a house lot. It may be a large tract of land subdivided. It may even have some roads into it. But there is no housing solution on that land. It's actually not in use. I am concerned, and I would encourage as part of this plan to look at the food security, that we really consider how much land do we need for residential use? How much do we need? And do we already have enough of it? And perhaps when I leave this chamber today, Mr. President, many of the developers that I work for will be outside with large stones to throw at me for saying that. But as a Barbadian, the reality is that we need to consider how much land that we have and what can we use it for. And if we are going to say that food security is important to us, and if we are going to recognize that when events happen in the world that affect us, that fundamentally we need to produce enough protein, enough carbs, and enough vegetables to sustain our population. If we can't do it ourselves because we're on a tropical island, we need to look to our neighbors who have land abundant to them, and we need to have some solutions. So I support the resolution from all of those aspects. And I just want to finish my few comments, Mr. President, in supporting this resolution by commenting on what we cannot do. Let's be realistic in our food security to recognize that if in fact our borders were closed and we had to rely on feeding ourselves, as far as I'm aware, again, not an expert, in order for us to raise chickens in Barbados, we import the broiler eggs and we grow them. We can't produce enough chickens ourselves. And we don't produce the pesticides that we need to be able to do the intense crop that we have. So we still have to import that. And we need fertilizer. So we need all of these things. And this is expensive in the world. So when we aim towards food security, we also have to think of all of those other things that mean if we're going to have food security, we have to have security around what is the solution for that. And the last link I would like to make is between tourism and food security or agriculture. I get regular comments from repeat visitors to our island who love the place. They love the sun, the sea, the sand, the people. They love the food they can eat. They love the attractions. But there are a few things that they don't love. And many of them have been talked about in here. But one of them that perhaps is not talked about is how does the island look? And when you leave Grantley Adams International Airport and you drive to what is called the Platinum Coast, and it's the Platinum Coast because that's where we get our highest rates for visitors, right? It's the Caribbean Sea, it's the Western Sun, it's the white sand, it's all of those things. But when they leave Grantley Adams International Airport and they drive there, more and more that drive is through bush, land that is not in productive use, not manicured like how it used to be. And our agriculture section, industry, did many things for us, including the manicuring of that land. And manicuring that land, along with it, came the suck wells that were maintained. So when you see a 200-acre plantation or a 500-acre plantation in St. Thomas or St. George or any of the high rainfall districts, and you see that it has gone to bush, Mr. President, I can guarantee you that all of the suck wells are also clogged. And as a result, the water that falls there, the high rainfall, is not getting to our aquifer. And as a result of it not getting to our aquifer, we are becoming more and more of a water scarce nation. And I heard before in this chamber someone make the argument that we're not necessarily water scarce. God gives us enough coming from above and we could desalinate around us, but we can't capture it, we can't do with it as we should. So I raise this tourism side of it. I raise to you what is the spin-off benefits of achieving a food security by using our land, being good custodians of the land, using it in a worthwhile way. There's lots of other benefits to it, including the manicuring of the land and tourism, including water resources, including soil erosion, because with sugarcane, it's a grass, and it keeps the soil together. And we need the sugarcane to rotate the crops as well. So that's outside of my area of expertise. So, Mr. President, those few comments on this resolution was mainly just to say that this resolution, it's big in its goal. I support it. I believe that along the way we will achieve many things if we can look back at this and let us think about all of the interconnectivity of the marketplace, of capital, of labor, of education, of land use policy, and of the environment. And when we look at that policy, I'm obliged to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator Malalu. Senator Drakes.
Thank you, Mr. President. I too would like to echo the sentiments of the former speaker in complimenting and congratulating Senator Dr. Brathwaite for bringing this private member's resolution to the chamber and acknowledging its importance in terms of food security and the future development of Barbados. Mr. President, I would like to confess that I am trying to improve my green thumb. I am not someone who is, plant savvy, animal savvy in that regard. There are some people who, once they throw something in the ground, it springs. I have an aunt who it does not matter what she plants, it grows. I am not that blessed. I'm trying to be that blessed, but not yet, Mr. President. And by all accounts, people know me for my pursuits in economics, sustainable development, but close to my heart is one day becoming a small farmer, Mr. President. Good. So now that I put that out into the atmosphere and into the universe, hopefully it will come back to me tenfold. Yes. Don't make some persons have said delusions of grandeur, Crystal, but nonetheless, Mr. President. But what I want to say is persons who are we call quote unquote younger generation in Barbados, and it was mentioned just now, are not moving into the agricultural sector. And for all intents and purposes, it is because it is not seen necessarily as lucrative. And what I have found, Mr. President, is persons who are farmers, who are engaged in agricultural activities, who are fisher folk, for instance, have a background in it in terms of their family history. It is something that is passed on to them through the older generation, and then they themselves get into it, because farming is not a job, it is not a 9-to-5, it is a lifestyle. It is something that if you do not understand the intricacies of it, if you're not committed to it, Mr. President, then it is difficult for you to take somebody who has had the traditional quote-unquote education and then place them in an agricultural environment and allow them to thrive, Mr. President. Sir, for context, in the last 10 years, non-sugar agriculture in Barbados has averaged about $100 million. And that tells two stories. At best, we have not reduced our agricultural production somewhat, but at the same time, we have not had significant progress in terms of increasing the value of the agricultural production in Barbados. And what is also important in terms of looking at how the sector is progressing is, as far as I know and that I can find, is there are no accessible statistics in relation to the acreage of land in production, as well as volume of production. I think if we have a better understanding as well of those two types of statistics, then we get a better sense in terms of our productivity, the level of productivity that is going on in the agricultural sector. Under the Sustainable Development Goal number 2, zero hunger, there is a target 2.3, which states to increase agricultural productivity per worker. And in the context of Barbados, we really have to ask the question again, if we're asking persons to come into the sector to increase the productivity and the production of the sector, what type of livelihood are we offering those individuals? What type of income are we offering those individuals? At present, and I stand corrected on this statistic, 2.5% of our labor force is engaged in agricultural activity, just about 35 to 4,000 persons, I believe, Mr. President. But again, I stand corrected on that statistic. And what is clear, Mr. President, is we have no real understanding of things like the equity in the sector. Of those 4,000 persons, how many of them are actually landowners? Who are the landowners, Mr. President? Who are the ones reaping the real returns from agriculture? And I think that is where the discussion in terms of the cultural or the racial divide that was mentioned earlier comes into the discussion. Because, Mr. President, we cannot speak about agriculture in terms of placing persons on land that they do not own for wages that are below or on the poverty line, Mr. President. We cannot ask persons in a 2023 Barbados, where we're saying we want to modernize the sector, where we're not offering persons the ability to own the land that they're working. We are not offering them the business opportunity around agriculture. If we're offering them just wage earnings, it is something that people will shy away from because it is then a remnant of our colonial past. So, Mr. President, when I think about youth in agriculture, there is also this lack of knowledge. There's a lack of understanding. And this is even in relation to being very specific, and it was noted in Dr. Brathwaite's presentation, the science behind agriculture. The persons that we're training or asking to get into food production, how well versed are they in things like basic physiology, biochemistry, Mr. President? These things matter if we're talking about creating the value added that we often talk about, because at a very molecular level, you have to have an understanding of the plants, the animals that you're dealing with in order to create new products, new services, increase crop yields. All of those things are based on a scientific understanding of what's happening to plants and animals. And I do not think we have the technical capacity at scale in terms of those persons who are moving into the agricultural sector at the moment. And clearly, as was mentioned, if we're producing 2 graduates, I believe it was, that was mentioned, and one graduate, Mr. President, you understand the dynamics that we're dealing with in terms of having that scientific basis for agriculture. So third, it means that we have to be more strategic in relation to how we target young people, what are the things we're training them in terms of food production, and how attractive the sector can become in the future. Third, but all of these things are tied to some key areas that we have to also be cognizant of. So in terms of the first part of my presentation was about the livelihoods and the incomes and increasing food production. Sir, but that is then tied to and constrained by soil, the quality of our soils. That is a major, major aspect of food production. Soil degradation, Mr. President, has the ability to affect how much you increase your food production by. And it is an area of biodiversity loss that has been now put on a global scale, where we have the hashtag Save Soil initiative that is being promoted by our soca icon, Masha Montana, to Indian activist Vandana Shiva. And what is clear is we don't understand, at least not in the public domain, what is the state of our soils at the moment. I know back in the 1960s, there was a soil map for Barbados. That's the only version that I know of, Mr. President. But I think one of the things that could be instructive and informative is having an updated soil map for Barbados that allows us to make decisions in relation to land use planning. And then we can further then have a better understanding of what are the competing interests, and then furthermore, make decisions that are based on what is happening at the ground level in terms of the information. But I do know we have the Soil Conservation Unit, Mr. President, and what I would like is for us to hear more from that unit in terms of information being disseminated to the public. I think that would be very useful. And how is that unit being utilized to the best of its ability in the Ministry of Agriculture in terms of food security and increasing food production? Because, Mr. President, in order to have nutritious food, you have to have nutrient-dense soil. Sometimes you see in the supermarkets, people talk about the lack of color in some fruits or vegetables. And that is also an indication of how nutritious a food is, Mr. President. And if we are not talking about these things in a holistic and integrated way, then we get lost sometimes in the conversation about what it is we're producing, because we don't just want to produce for producing sake, but we also want to produce nutritious foods for the general public. And that, Mr. President, is critical in terms of nutrient-dense soil. Sir, I want to quickly just speak about the Barbados National Strategic, the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan 2020. Because agriculture has a cross-cutting theme to a number of other areas in terms of our development planning. In that document, there is, on page 34, a table that speaks to the implementation gap for the 2002 report. And in that plan, it stated that Objective 12, to promote the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity in various sectors, agricultural, health, fisheries, and tourism. There was Strategy 1, and that was specifically related to agriculture. And it stated to encourage agricultural biodiversity conservation and sustainably use by revising approaches to agricultural management. So in that table, there were 15 activities that were listed that were not implemented. 15 activities, and this was since 2002, over 20 years ago. One of the things in that list, one of the activities in that list was to regulate and restrict the use of herbicides and pesticides, which result in biodiversity loss. Under the new plan, we have the same type of target in terms of target 4. By 2030, we are hoping that areas under agricultural, aquaculture, and forestry are managed sustainably and ensuring conservation of biodiversity. So I'm hoping that in 2042, we do not have the same list of activities that were not implemented. Sir, in 2020, this Parliament passed the Pesticides Control Amendment Act. And that established the Registrar of Pesticides and Pesticides Control Board. And to date, Mr. President, I am not sure if I've heard if either of those two mechanisms have been staffed, operationalized, if they have been functioning, and what progress has been made in terms of the activities under those two mechanisms. And I think that when we pass legislation in here and we don't hear the updates, we're not aware of what is happening on the ground, it can become almost a paper pushing exercise, dare I say it, in this chamber, because you don't feel as though the legislation that you're passing is having the impact that it's supposed to on the ground. And I just want to ask the question in terms also of the legislation that we just recently passed, in terms of the Animal Veterinary Health Bill, or Act, I should say, no, it's passed, and the Plant Protection Act. A number of authorities, two authorities in particular, were established under those acts. And as we move forward in terms of talking about agricultural production, we have to go back sometimes to see how far we've come so that we can establish the benchmarks, to know if we are falling short on our objectives, because we don't want that 20 years later, although we've passed an amendment in 2020 that establishes a registrar of pesticides, we are still not regulating pesticide use in Barbados. So, Mr. President, I do support the resolution in terms of the devising of a concrete and comprehensive plan for the agricultural sector in Barbados in relation to food security. And Senator Malalu touched on a number of areas as well in terms of land use, the environmental impacts. And it begs the question, do we want just to increase food production and enhance our food security? Or is it that we want to increase food production and enhance food security in the context that it has a net benefit effect to people and the environment? Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Drakes. Senator Dr. Haynes.
Good morning, good afternoon, Mr. President. Thank you for acknowledging me today. I also would like to really express how much of a pleasure it has been to read this Vision for the Future of Agriculture in Barbados, compiled by Senator Dr. Brathwaite. And I certainly do support his call, to get it correct, for an integrated food security plan for Barbados. And I think the emphasis on this being an integrated plan is really critical, not one that sees agriculture in a simplistic way. And I learned so much from reading this document that he so graciously provided for us all. It is about 10 years old. So though it is somewhat dated, I still find it to be very relevant. The document speaks specifically about global financial crisis and not the crisis that we have just come out of, although this also, the COVID-19 pandemic and I guess other crises that we have experienced and also will experience, they bear some similarities in terms of the consequences. So while I can accept that there is some refreshing of this document that will be required in order to make this a developmental document for Barbados, I think so much of it remains pertinent, and the fact that it remains pertinent tells us a bit about how little we have done in the intervening decade to address agriculture. So while we were locked down with restricted movement, when we were on pause and these kinds of things, some of us did attempt to take up agriculture, some more successfully than others. Some had green thumbs, brown thumbs. I killed a lot of things, not people, just plants. But I also was successful in growing some. But what this really taught me in a kind of experiential way is that agriculture is not necessarily easy. People tend to think, oh, you could just go and do some farming, go and plant some things. But it is not. It's not as simple as that. I can get some things to grow, but so many things happen. There's a level of vigilance that is required, and I don't have any big crops. Just over a small garden to deal with pests, and are your plants getting too much sun? Do they have enough shade? Are you giving them too much water? There are all of these things that those of us who think that this is something easy to do, that does not require a high level of skill, qualifications, knowledge, and sometimes this knowledge can be generated through experience as well. So while I take the point about graduates in agriculture, I would also want to point out that I can't say how many students, how many persons are involved in the study of agriculture in Barbados and from Barbados by just looking at what is occurring at the University of the West Indies. Because I know that there is an associate degree program at Barbados Community College, and I know that there are persons who are gaining the NVQ and CVQs in agriculture while they are participating in the sector itself. So there are various ways that persons are becoming certified, and I hope that there are pathways if persons really want to go even further to translate some of these certifications into other things. So entryways, perhaps if persons want to go that far, into university level qualifications if required or persons are interested. And we can talk here about the undergraduate level or at the postgraduate level. But I think there is a lot of education in agriculture that maybe we do not capture. That says to me that there is interest. And perhaps we need to do a little bit more to build on that interest. In particular, when we get to learn that agriculture is not just going and pushing something in the ground and it is automatically going to grow. It is challenging. It is a science. I would say is an art as well. And it does require a wealth of knowledge that I think that we could encourage people to think about. To think of this as a career, a way of life. So, an integrated plan, I think, is essential. And what some of the things that Senator Brathwaite has pointed out in what he has laid out as, I would say, the draft, I would call it the draft of this plan. Agriculture as not just primary agriculture. He spoke in this document about the emphasis on primary agriculture. But if we are thinking about developing different sectors in Barbados, the emphasis on other areas, the food and agricultural sector, as he calls it, which includes a manufacturing component, considering the connections between agriculture and the development of other types of businesses and products that can generate jobs for persons and also potentially generate foreign exchange. These are revenue generating sectors. So when we're talking about agriculture, this is not just stop at pulling something out of the ground or taking something off of a tree, but can feed industrialization, certain manufacturing sector in particular, I would say here. Beyond that, Senator Brathwaite has pointed out for us the importance of agrotourism. So often when we speak about tourism, this is not our emphasis. And I found this really instructive. If I may just refer to the 5 dimensions of agrotourism that he points out. Agro-heritage tourism, farm-based ecotourism, community tourism, health and wellness tourism, and culinary tourism. So we don't have to see agriculture as something that feeds tourism in terms of just provides food for persons who are coming to the island. And that is important. It is important to provide food to visitors as well as to locals. But agriculture can also be a draw. We need to start thinking about tourism differently, and I think that an integrated approach also says to us that agriculture is beyond just farming. Agriculture, this can be a series of attractions, and not attractions where persons just go and say, oh, that's really pretty, but also experiences, which I gather many people want to have when they go on their vacation. Experiences. So this is very, very, this document, I believe, is instructive. It speaks about climate change. even though it is a document that is 10 years old, and the significance, the connection between agriculture and climate change. And one of the things that stood out to me as well, in particular when we think about cost of living today, there are so many complaints about cost of living today, not just today. From the time I know myself, there are complaints about cost of living. But right now, we know people are really expressing how difficult it has been and it can be to afford things in Barbados. And when we look at the contribution of food imports to the cost of living in Barbados, to me it is amazing. And if we want to think about food security for the country, that is useful. But we can also think about food security and security for ourselves, that agriculture, domestic agriculture, can provide. And this does not mean that all of us have to be farmers, but it does mean that if we emphasize how important investing and focusing and putting energy into agriculture can be for driving down the cost of living, we really can be addressing some serious social concerns while also dealing with these other areas that Senator Brathwaite has done so well in this resolution to bring to our attention. So although I find all of this commendable, there's one thing that stood out to me, and this is because I received a video last year on International Women's Day. And this video was about women involved in agriculture in Barbados. And again, eye-opening to me. These women who are farmers talked about the contributions of agriculture to their lives. To their lives in terms of their abilities to, first of all, find productive employment, to be educated while on the job through the NVQ and CVQ, these kind of tracks, and also just through the experience of participating in farming, and their ability to provide for their families because they are able to actually bring food and not have to purchase everything from the supermarket. And I think it is very important that when we create these integrated plans, that we start to do some other things, such as have some gender focus and gender emphasis in them. And what we know is that around the world, in developing countries, women constitute 40% of the agricultural labor force. As Senator Drake said, we don't know a lot about the composition for Barbados of land ownership. Who owns the land? We don't know this. Well, I don't know this. Maybe this information exists somewhere. But we don't know who these individuals are. We don't have this information, to my knowledge, disaggregated by gender either. And I think this will be useful in helping us to do some integrated planning as well. We have a lot of discussion about the problems that men face in Barbados, and we can see these things come into the fore when we look at violent crimes and crime statistics. And this is important. How do we have an approach that strategizes for agriculture, that seeks to bring benefits to men and boys who may be pulled into other activities, and also that thinks about the gendered nature of our relationships in Caribbean societies in Barbados, in which, whatever people may say about this, our households still tend to be predominantly female-headed households. And what we can see from some of the research that comes out of the United Nations is that there has been some emphasis, strategic emphasis, on encouraging women to be involved in agriculture so that they can provide for their families, so that they can provide nutritious food for their families, so that they can be contributors to their country's development, while also emphasizing areas such as food security and all of these others that I have previously highlighted coming from Dr. Brathwaite's very good document. There is a bit of information that I was able to find about women and men in agriculture in Barbados. And this is from, this computer will cooperate with me right now, a 2019 study, the UN Women's Status of Women and Men Report, a gender analysis of labor data and policy frameworks in 6 CARICOM member states. This is from 2019. And in 2019, across the region, men are more likely to be formally employed in agriculture than women. In Barbados' statistic for 2019, 2,903 men compared to 1,123 women recorded in agriculture. Barbados actually performs quite well compared to some of our neighbors in terms of that gender balance. And I'm not necessarily saying that everything has to be 50% women, 50% men. But what I am saying is that in terms of, so this is a small number, as Senator Drake brought to our attention. It is a small number. But it is a number that I think we should place some emphasis on if we are considering things like, we talk a lot about poverty alleviation and addressing living standards and people's abilities to provide for themselves. Maybe we need to go beyond framing agriculture as a sector that is in place primarily to serve the supermarket or the market or the tourists, and as a sector that really can be critical for addressing some of these issues that we face in society. So this is the one area that I would love to see a bit more emphasis on in an integrated policy. Those persons in our society who may live and operate on the periphery, who may be disadvantaged for various reasons. And I'm not saying that they should be put into agriculture because this is some kind of low-class approach to providing jobs or skills for people, but because agriculture is really crucial and it can be at the center of our continued development. And if it is crucial and can be at the center of our continued development, and it can be lucrative and it can feed families, such persons really need to be at the center of this. Mr. President, I don't have a lot more that I can say besides that. I believe that this is excellent work that Senator Dr. Brathwaite has done. His expertise, his years of knowledge in the area certainly shine through. I'm appreciative to him for bringing this to all of us, and I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Hines. Senator Reverend Dr. Rogers.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Good morning, colleagues. Good afternoon. I rise, like the other senators who have spoken before, to give my full support to this resolution that has been placed on the table by Senator Dr. Brathwaite. I think it's timely. I believe that the events of the last decade, or just over a decade, stemming from the economic downturn of 2008 and the subsequent catastrophes that we've faced in the world since then, have been stark reminders to us or indicators to us of the importance of the ability to at least provide something for ourselves in times of trial. And so this resolution is timely and important at this time. But I dare say it is not simply about the provision of food for our people. I would go further, as others have said, it's about the production of nutritious food for our people. I wouldn't simply say it's just the production of food or nutritious food, but this particular resolution is all-encompassing because it touches many facets of our national development and many departments of our governance. Just to give a historical context, sir, I do not really subscribe to the view that the negativity to agriculture in some quarters has come some way because of many of our descendants being slaves. I can remember growing up and it was agriculture that provided what was necessary to school us. I suspect that we've gotten too bright and perhaps do not realize the importance of what was being done by our parents and grandparents back in the past. If you ask a young person today what is a speculator, they probably can't tell you. But many of us would know that when the speculator came, that's when your parents and grandparents got some money I have to say what the speculator is. The speculator is the gentleman who came around to check on your pig to see the size and what kind of price the pig is worth and that kind of thing. And that, there we go. And that provided the money. I grew up I spent my early years with a grandmother in Welch St. John, and I can remember her going out into the backyard with an apron on, and it had the pockets, and she would come back with pigeon peas and bonivis, and then she had the sheep in the yard, she had pigs there, she had bananas that she would cut, and those would be sold. These are the things that kept the household going. So I dare say that we do have a history of a positivism about agriculture, that it was not necessarily seen as negative. I think what has happened is, as I said, our development has pushed us to believe that we need not do those things anymore. And some of the very persons who would have been schooled on the pig now turn their back on the pig and farming and the other things that we do. But we grew up with a steady diet and all those things. And I pity the person, I'm asking a break from my vegetarian friends. I pity the person who hasn't had a good belly soup, sir. You know, sheep belly, pig belly, every belly. And these are the things that kept us strong. Or a good cowskin sauce, or anything like that. So I'm just saying these things to say these are the things that nurtured us. But we've had a drifting away from that kind of diet from generation to generation. And so I believe part of food security deals with some aspect of retraining the taste buds of our people to eat what is actually grown on the island. I'm not saying you have to eat the pork and everything, but I also, I'm speaking for my vegetarian friends. I'm very conscious of what they're going through with me mentioning these things, so I'm making sure I cover this part of it. I know what I think, sir. In fact, today, sir, the gospel lesson in church was in Mark's Gospel, chapter 7, and verse 14 and following. And in verse 15, Jesus said, "It is not what goes into the man that defiles the man, but what comes out. And therefore he declared all foods clean." So I'm just thought I'd point out that one. That was actually today's lesson before I came here, sir. A point of... So food security may be about retraining the taste buds of our people to eat what is actually produced on the island, getting our young children to eat yam and potato and sweet and edibles and those kinds of things again. Of course, that takes us into another sector because it requires advertising. It requires us to, as Senator Brathwaite, when he made his presentation on this resolution, give some of the nutritional values of these things compared to some of the things that are imported. And I happen to know that campaigns work very well in Barbados. There was a time, sir, I don't know if you remember, when Barbadians had eased off on eating pork. And then all of a sudden, that was in the early 90s, I think it was, all of a sudden they got an ad about proper pork, and now pigs are running scared in Barbados, sir. Even 2 Saturdays ago, sir, I usually give the guys down by me a little trouble, the Rasta fellas and things. So I saw one of them with a styrofoam packet, and I said, "I think I smell pork in there." And he said, "Reb, boy, pigtail ain't pork here." So I went by another one to verify, and he said, "Yeah, Reb, pigtail ain't pork." So even... Let me apologize to my Rastafarian friends who don't believe that, but this is what I heard from some who are. So we need some campaigns, sir, to drill down on the nutritious value of the foods we produce here and what they can do for us in terms of our diet. As Senator Drakes pointed out, in fact, all the senators who have spoken thus far, there's not much data on agriculture in Barbados or even consumption, food consumption in Barbados, and I think that that is important. because it is not just about planting food, it is what we plant and where, when, and how, and so on. So I think these are things that we need to pay close attention to if we're going to build out this dream of becoming food secure. Of course, we will never be able to produce 100% of what we consume here. I think that is a reality. We just do not have the land space for it. The last statistic I read somewhere, I can't remember where I read it, I don't know if I should say it here, but 32.7% of the land in Barbados is arable land. So that tells us something. We just cannot produce enough here to provide for our population. But I do believe, as Senator Dr. Brathwaite would have pointed out, we really need to invest in technology. The move toward food security will come with a heavy influence on science. And we need to pay attention to the science. And why do I say that, sir? I was doing a little research on Singapore. You know, we often compare ourselves to Singapore. Again, a small territory and so on. And Singapore in 2019 came up with what they refer to as the 30 by 30 plan. That is producing 30% of what is consumed in the country by 2030. But they can do that because they have statistical data. They can do that because they know what they need to do in order to produce that. We'll just be shooting in the dark. So we really need to get some statistics and an understanding of what is happening in the country. That being said, sir, it doesn't mean that something isn't being done. And I wish to compliment the government of Barbados, commend them for the FEED program that was introduced in 2019, and that is the Farmers Empowerment and Enfranchisement Drive. It's supposed to be a 3-year program running from 2019 to 2022. And just to state a few objectives of this program, sir, to increase the agricultural sector's contribution to the GDP, to ensure long-term national food and nutrition security through improved access to safe and nutritious foods, to increase employment, particularly among vulnerable groups, including women and youth, to increase investment in the agricultural sector through provision of infrastructure and support services, and to increase net foreign exchange earnings through increased agricultural exports. But what impressed me about this, sir, were the terms and conditions of this FEED program. Farmers who are interested will be able to lease plots of land ranging in size from 1/4 acre to 5 acres. Irrigation water will be provided and subsidized at a rate in most cases. But important, sir, 1 acre of land can be had at a rental fee of $300 per year. That's $25 a month. That is something that we can invest in, sir. That is progressive. And I want to encourage people. I don't know how many people know of this project. Because if I had the time to do a little something, $300 an acre of land, and so on, with a little water subsidized, that is a steal, sir. And that is something I believe that people should, this is something that should be advertised more heavily. I can't remember seeing it anywhere. And the minister in the Ministry of Agriculture, according to the GIS in 2020 September 8th report, the minister in the Ministry of Agriculture committed the government to receiving 40% of what is grown, giving such people a ready market. These are the things that we need to highlight, and this is what can push us towards this food security that we're hoping for. The FEED the Land for the Landless program, which would have existed a long time before that as well. The FEED program covers open field crop production, greenhouse farming, temperature control, container farming, livestock production, fish farming, aquaponics, apiculture, that's beekeeping, fruit tree, agroforestry, forage fodder production, etc. So there is something happening. There's a lot happening. But now we have to ask ourselves, why aren't our people getting involved? I know we've talked about the young people not being interested in agriculture, sir. I beg to differ. I have noticed, I don't know if the other senators have, that when they have these police drug busts, those plants look pretty healthy to me. Just saying, you know, so, and food security is not simply about planting food for consumption, but it's about providing people with a means by which they can purchase food. And so it's not only about food crops, it's about those things from which they can earn a living. I know we have the medicinal cannabis industry, where two of the senators in here would have been, one is and one was, at the head of that organization. But I dare say, I still have some problems with that, sir. As I would have pointed out in my debate on that, I do not believe that we should be planting anything in Barbados that is above 0.3% THC. But in as much as it is there, the question is, who has access to it? Who has access to it? Can a bank lend me money to invest in it? Or do I have to have capital up front? I'm just asking a question. Yes. So I'm just leaving it there, sir, to say that there may be areas that our young people are interested. I know that there are some entrepreneurs as well, because the government from time to time misses its cassavas from its ground. And there are people who are more than interested in selling agricultural produce. I'm just saying that's there. But even for those invested in agriculture, sir, we have some things that we have to fix first. We have to fix the problem of predial larceny, sir. I know that I've heard that under the new medicinal cannabis industry, people are going into drone technology and all those kinds of things. But for the average person doing his or her farming on a small plot of land, we really need to have some firm penalties for people carrying people's stuff away. I spoke to a plantation owner several years ago, and he said, you know, he would call the police, he would go to court, and one day he went to court dealing with a case, and back in the ground the afternoon, the fellow passing, hey buddy, I can pass later. As if just joking at the system. And so I know that particular plantation owner decided, all right, I'll fix that. And so when his crops are getting near the point to harvest, there's some floodlights set up, and if you're bad, pass through there and hope that you get back out. It's just simple as that. I'm not supporting it, but that's just the length that people have to go to protect their things. And even in people with their small little plot, just yesterday, sir, I visited one of my members. This lady walks with a cane. She has a problem walking, but she goes into her garden every evening and she does a little thing. And she said, you know, Rev, I had a bunch of planting right there, and just when somebody came and cut them. Somebody came and cut them. And these are the things that are happening in Barbados and deterring people from getting involved in agriculture as well. We also have to deal with, as Senator Drake sort of pointed out, and I believe some others, crop pests. A few weeks ago, we dealt with, when we were dealing with the Animal Protection Bill, I made mention of some parakeets that we're seeing on the island, some green parakeets. And I just read an article in the Jamaican Observer from January 7th, where they're now having problems with them. It is called the rose wing or the Indian ringneck parakeet. And the problem with these things is that, as the Jamaican Observer points out, they attack corn, gungo peas, and citrus. I'm sure that we've seen the WhatsApp video going around of a whole cornfield just being ravaged here in Barbados by those birds. And what is dangerous about them, sir, is that they multiply rapidly. They multiply rapidly and they move around in packs of 700 or so. So, flocks, yeah. I sound like another, anyway, don't touch that one. Flocks of 700 or so. And we saw what happened to that cornfield for those who saw the video. You can imagine a farmer, as we've pointed out, farming isn't easy. It is not an easy job. And you have your crops, and then all of a sudden something comes. And that must have been something that was brought in here by someone. So I'm just saying that we need to look at that as well. And of course, we had the nice debate. I call it a debate because they were not talking to each other, but they spoke to the same thing about culling monkeys or what we should do with them. And I know that St. Martin has embarked on a program of culling, but as our Minister of Agriculture said, we just cannot do certain things here because we are involved in treaties with others. So we have to come up with a solution for dealing with the monkeys. I tried during the COVID period, as Senator Dr. Hines pointed out. I built a little cage, sir, to plant things in. And the monkey pushed his hand through the cage to try to get my stuff, but he couldn't get them. But I'm just saying that that's the extent that I had to go to get something to grow. And so we have some challenges where agriculture is concerned and where this food security that we hope for to achieve is concerned. Senator Malulu mentioned land space, sir. And as I said, I read where only 32.7% of our land is arable. But again, we can learn from the Singapore model. Because Singapore, being a small country, what they have done is invested in technologies where they are growing in buildings, vertical agriculture. So 1 acre of land can actually give you 5. And if we can get some property investors and so on interested in assisting people along those lines and assisting the government along those lines, we can, or even a private sector venture, 1 acre of Barbadian land can give you enough space to produce 5 acres of produce. Or you can even, I don't know how high you can go, but these are things that we need to look at if we're going to put a dent in this food security problem. Culturally, as I said, we've changed. We have moved away from a market culture to a supermarket culture. And that brings with it some added cost. Farmers are having difficulty finding outlets for their goods. They would produce their produce in the supermarket, will buy it at a low price, and by the time they go in, they can't believe that that's the same thing that they had. I'll leave the experts to give us the solution for that one. But what I would like to say, sir, is that whatever we do, there will be some people that just will not have the wherewithal to purchase food, or the quality food that they would like. And I'm going to be a bit controversial here. We're on 166 square miles. I can get a house in the Heights and Terraces and get 2 dogs, but I can't put a sheep or 10 little chickens in a coop. couple little layers to keep things going in the yard. And these are things we have to look at, you know. Because a chicken takes a 1-by-1 space to grow, a broiler. If you have a little 4-by-4 space, even if we put a little cap of 10, a household could still do a little something for itself. I know for sure, sir, that when you compare the smell of dog mess to that of sheep mess smells like perfume. I'm just saying that. I have a sheep, sir. I said it was going to be controversial. I have a sheep, so I speak from experience. I have a sheep and a dog. I'm just raising that. But in addition, sir, I believe that there should be some level or encouragement of subsistence amongst our people to get people to do a little something to supplement the pot when things come. I know a lot of people do it, and you know, more in the country than anywhere else, but I want to encourage Barbadians to look towards that as well. If we do not deal with some of these things, sir, our hope of food security will just be a pipe dream. And as I said, it is not just about food, but producing nutritious food and making sure that people have access to nutritious food. If we fail in this regard, we'll be submitting Barbadians to the Momokufo Ando diet. I don't know if any of you know it. The Momokufo Ando diet. I know people know about the keto diet and so on, but the Momokufo Ando diet, sir. Momokufo Ando is the Japanese gentleman who invented instant ramen. And if we do not do something to ensure that our people can have access to nutritious food, we'll be subjecting them to the Momokufo Ando diet. And the last state will be worse than the first. So with those words, sir, I wish to support this resolution, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Senator Dr. Rogers. Senator King.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I too rise to lend my voice to this particular resolution, which I also support. A lot of what has been said already, I completely agree with, but I want to take the opportunity to, I don't want to be controversial, but I think sometimes we speak around in circles and dodge some of the things that can be a little bit contentious. So I'll go historically. So I came to this lovely country in 1970. One of the things I noticed then, when I came here, was that all of the houses within rural Barbados where I lived had either kitchen gardens, fruit trees, sheep, goat, chickens, ducks, guinea birds. You could go on and on and on. There were not so many supermarkets at that particular point in time. Therefore, necessity drove people to be innovative and inventive in order to provide themselves with a meal. Education at that particular time was paramount. Everybody was telling you, get a real good education because they don't want you to go in fields like me. And it was interesting that at that particular point in time, when you were in school, those people who were grasping education as well as they could were sent to the garden to do what? agriculture. Because the thinking at that particular point in time, like it or not, was that agriculture was for the non-academic students. And people therefore began to develop an idea, and this is why you only get one person doing agriculture. That smart people are not supposed to be involved in agriculture. It's for the people who can grasp these things very well. You also had, in the 90s, a building boom, within which landowners offloaded their lands to do housing projects. So we had a lot of land going out of agriculture. You gotta be real. Stop playing games. Because the decisions that you make and the actions that you take will come back to haunt you. That is what we're facing now. The decisions that we made concerning agriculture. Now, I sat and I've listened to people in here, people on the outside, people on the calling programs talking about agriculture in terms of Barbados exporting things. Remove that dream from your head. This is a dream, a pipe dream. Look at, you don't have the space. You don't have the capacity to create products or whatever that are going to match larger territories or even give people the pricing of other things. But if you're going to go into niche market areas that you are prepared to do excellently, then you have an opportunity to cut out those markets for yourself. I have always said that if I were dealing with sugar, I was not selling bulk sugar to nobody, nowhere in the world at all. Not happening. If I had my own way, there are lots of people in the world who have large egos. And they like to know that they can have things that the rest of the world cannot have. That would be my target market. If it means that all of the sugar that I produce, I had to sell it to Dubai or Saudi Arabia or wherever, where people will be prepared to pay me anything for it because nobody else can get it, I would do it. But in putting out bulk sugar the way that we do it now, you're never going to make a profit. Those days are done. So we have to think, how do I get this into markets, specialized markets, in a complete different way? Same thing will happen with your other agricultural products. Look, I walk around this country and I see castor oil trees growing wild all over Barbados. No one has stopped to ask, what can we do with castor oil? Can we create a product using this castor oil that is unique? What can we do with it? So there are lots of things that we bypass and then argue about agriculture. You could go online. You see people in the middle of a desert growing food. I understand climate change is real. I understand it. But if you're going to tell me, and I think Senator Rogers made a point, we have to look to the science. Because if people in the middle of a desert are growing food, the science is there. You see people taking airplanes and going in the sky and releasing things to cause rain to fall and catching the rainwater in the desert. So the science is there. The question is, are we prepared to go this route? Or do we only see agriculture as how we know it? Land space should not be an issue in terms of growing things for food security, not for export, for food security. Senator Rogers made the point that I wanted to make also, that in urban areas, all the way in Singapore and other places in Asia, People are producing lots of food in small spaces. We have to be able to look to these types of countries and find out what they're doing it, how they're doing it, and follow suit. Look for the best practices. But for us to continue to tell ourselves that we don't have enough land space, when we also only have a population of about 300,000 people, we gotta get more serious than this. But you see, what's happened is that we've become so accustomed over the years to importing things. From one administration to the other, I have listened to people talk about the import bill high, the import bill high, the import bill high. One person I ever saw took a radical approach to some things many, many years, I remember as a child, and he smiled. One prime minister put a ban on English apples. I will never forget it as long as I live. One. And I'm saying here today that if we are serious, really serious, there are some things that we produce, and you made the point when you said the 100% of the things we don't produce, but we should eat 100% of the things we do produce. And there are some things that come from, as the old people would say, over and away, that we can do without. They are not going to make us any more healthier, or they're not going to make us live longer. But you see, the price of progress is high. So that when we believe that to get our hands dirty, or as you said, Senator Rogers, to smell the cow dung, or whatever else, becomes a problem for us. It becomes a big problem for us, but it's not a problem for the farmers in other places in the world whom we then turn around and buy these products from. Now, someone will have to explain to me, why do I need lamb? Thank you. Lamb chops from New Zealand. Why do I need it? The only reason I need it is because I refuse to produce enough for myself. And pretty lastly is a serious problem that we also have to deal with, but we gotta get serious about it too. You know, there's so many things, so many examples I can bring to this chamber of seeing things over the years that are disturbing in terms of the effect that they have on us. It leads me to wonder sometimes as a people, what are we thinking? Because collectively, we know what the problems are. And collectively, we know how to solve the problems. But for some unknown reason, we seem to be just satisfied to talk about it. And they always say, you know, why is it so many times I have to sit down and listen to people in other parts of the world come to tell me things that I already know, or things that I have done before. Like I remember many years ago, I went to an exhibition at BIDC. And in this exhibition, there were two things that stood out to me. One, they talked about the invention, and this is what it was in this thing, the invention of tomato ketchup. And in this thing, it claimed that Barbadian farmers at that time, who were working for landowners in England, who owned land in Barbados, spoilage was a lot in terms of shipping tomatoes to England. And they came up with the idea of putting it into like a paste and shipping it. Years afterwards, I was in LA, went into a bookshop and bought a health book. Saw in that book, 1703, grapefruit founded in Barbados. First thing I opened the book and I saw it. I thought to myself, wow, 1703 is also the year that they started talking about shipping rum. So it tells me then that there had to be something going on in Barbados at that particular point in time in agriculture that all of these things were happening. You have to ask yourself, what went wrong? For years, you've heard people talk about the experiments on sugar cane and stuff in Barbados. And technologies and things that we've shared with the rest of the world. You have to ask yourself, where did we go wrong? And I remember as a child also, never forget it, seeing there was a van that used to come out in rural Barbados and collect breadfruit to ship out of Barbados. I remember it well. And then come back to the larceny thing, because I also had an experience with it. Used to work at government industrial schools. We had a really good agricultural program. Really, really good. Boys and girls. And I remember sitting on the playing field with youngsters, boys playing cricket and stuff like that. That's terrible. The mentality of some people. And we had, when I tell you that we had lovely sheep. I remember us playing cricket and a van driving, stop, and a man ran out the van and snatched up the biggest ram that we had off the playing field and threw it in the back of the van and gone. Right, imagine myself and the boys. You can't go and run behind it now, because the boys might decide they get the other side and they get another side. All you could do is stand up in amazement and watch this. And this is the early 90s. And watch it. So imagine what it is like today, where we are not being our brother's keeper, but we are causing unnecessary problems for ourselves and our own food security by allowing this type of mentality to go virtually unpunished. I mean, I'm not a person who believes in a lot of punishment, but I believe that at some point in time, you have to get serious with some people, because some people just will not get it. And they don't understand their actions and how they impact not only on themselves, but on the lives of the persons who they steal the things from and the wider community. Because we come up in a society where bartering was a natural part of who we were. You know, you grow things and somebody come down by you, and your mother was saying something for somebody and somebody saying something for your mother. Everybody had. People could eat. So I want to take the opportunity just to plead with Barbadians, just to plead with them, that if you're really serious about reducing this import bill and all of us got to get our hands dirty. You got to do something. You know, I'm not saying that you have to do a big set of production that you're going to sell. That might not be the answer to your problem. But at least if you can grow some things for yourself, even if it's in a can, if it is in a bucket, whatever it is, you can go online if you don't know. There's lots of things online. You don't just go and look at foolishness. There's lots of things online that you could go and look at and learn. Learn something about agriculture, about other things that is going to be beneficial to you and your families. Because, you know, I found it interesting that a number of people would come to me when it was a minister. Minister, things in the supermarket real expensive. And I say all the time, you and I grew up together. What did we do when we were young? There's some things that we grew ourselves. Okras, beans, lettuce, tomatoes. I could go on and on. All these things that we used to do ourselves. But now, it seems as if that mindset that was mentioned in here on a number of occasions is the problem. Not lack of land, not lack of water, but it's a lack of will to get involved in agriculture. And so, Mr. President, I just want to take this opportunity to say to all the people in Barbados, you have everything that you need. You got good weather, you got water, you got soil. All it takes now is for a little bit, for all of us to do our little bit, and you will see how that huge import bill that we keep talking about can be reduced greatly by each and every one of us taking the effort to grow a little something for ourselves. With those few words, I'm obliged to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator King. Any more speakers? Senator Boyce, Kevin Boyce.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would not want the first private member's resolution that I have seen, sir, to go without me offering some comment, as well as offering my applause for the initiative of Senator Dr. Braffett, and echoing the accolades of the other members of this place. It certainly belies and shows the need for the active citizenry that was spoken of when we spoke about our new republic. And I think we are well on our way to seeing more activity with such private members in our midst. In any debate, and this derives from an attempt, sir, to persuade, we start by understanding what we're discussing. And we've heard a narrative of different aspects of it. Of course, the focus on agriculture. But I wanted to go back to the definition of what is food security as set out by some of the previous speakers. Food security, it seems, has three component parts: reliable access to the food, that there is sufficient quantity of food, and that the food is affordable and nutritious. So it seems, sir, that food security doesn't mean that you have access to poor food, but you have access to food of a certain nutritional value. And that's important when we look at what the data says about the current state of food security in the CARICOM region. In 2022, CARICOM and the World Food Programme conducted a survey. And it was found that in the English-speaking Caribbean, 4.1 million persons, 4.1 million persons are at risk for food insecurity, an increase of 1.3 million since the last time the survey was conducted, sir. Now, of course, the attributable factors were stated. We now have inflation at 10.2% throughout the CARICOM region. And we, of course, know the root causes have been stated time and time again. We're coming out of COVID, and of course, the war in Ukraine, supply chain impacts. This is the reality from the data, and of course, the document can be accessed from the CARICOM website, sir, which I'm referring to. So what is to be done? I think what we're doing today is part of the process, and we, of course, have to appreciate the effort of Dr. Braffett to get us here. But we see that the government has been very focused on the initiatives with our neighbors to the south, with their vast tracts of land and oil, and what we have the exchange with our black belly sheep going down and their produce coming up, and we utilize it as a transshipment point. We have heard statements of the Land for the Landless and the other programs as set out by our Senator Rogers, which I am sure the government in their response will expand upon. Actually, as a slight segue, I have to give Senator Rogers some lashes when he's speaking about persons living and having chickens and sheep on their property. He must remember that we all do not reside in a rectory. somewhat tighter spaces, sir. So on behalf of the independents, I certainly wouldn't want it to be said that it was said in the Senate chamber, Bajans ought to have chickens on all their property. Some who have a little more might be a little more comfortable. So I'm just reiterating the perspective, perhaps giving it another viewpoint. But sir, this is an important conversation, and it's a timely conversation, and we see how it correlates to what's going on in the region. Now, we say that the last time CARICOM, because there is a CARICOM policy for food, and the last time the CARICOM food policy was put in place was 2010. So we assume that the narrative of what we're discussing is also part and parcel of what is going on in a regional sense. In Barbados, the policy that we are now debating is 2012. So as cliche as it sounds, Mr. President, the time is obviously ripe, and the time is now to have this type of debate. The time, sir, we can say is also now because we've heard reference to what the experiences were during the COVID isolation. We remember the lines in the supermarket to try to get food. We all took part in some form of bartering or the other. Another anecdote, sir, I heard that, there were certain parishes which said that they were not subjected to the regulations, but that's a conversation for another time. Parishes far away from the central hub of business conducted their affairs in a slightly different way, sir. But sir, you were supposed to isolate, you were supposed to only shop on certain days, and it brought home, I think, the importance of food and access to food. And during that period, we would have exchanged stuff with neighbors, with family members. If you had excess of flour and somebody had extra fruits, you would organize. And we found that we got back to what was important because you were at home and you had to sustain yourself and your family, and you did what was necessary. The question is, have we learned the lessons now that we're returning to normal? It seems as though the new normal has gone and we're back to normal. Work from home done. Come back into the office. That's internationally. Have we learned the lessons as to what is important? The tourists are back now. Have we learned the lessons from when they weren't here? We have the food in the supermarket now. Have we learned the lesson when we didn't have and you had to queue to get what you wanted? Supply chain is back and running now. Have we learned the lesson? Well, it's improving. Have we learned the lessons from when it was totally broken? One ship, we saw what that caused. Now that the factories are reopening and things are smoothing out, have we learned the lessons? And when we hear about the lessons from the past, they may offer us some guidance. And maybe the fact is, the reality is that government has a lot on its plate. See what I did there, Mr. President? Government obviously has a lot on its plate, Mr. President. And it's hopefully that some of the discussion that we have and the initiatives that were listed and the more that will be listed will, of course, further the efforts to improve the access to the food. And an attendant argument, and I again have to give Dr. Haynes her flowers. Sir, in a previous sitting of this Senate, Senator Dr. Haynes raised the point of what we consumed and was derided by some, not by me, sir, when there was an attack on the macaroni pie and the other staples and sauce of the Barbadian palate, sir. And she was almost derided by other members, not me, sir. Not me. But when you think about it, sir, Senator Dr. Haynes was correct in that it's not just that you have access to food, but when we think about it, what food do we have easy access to? We have access to high fat, high salt, high sugar, and processed food. We have copious amounts of foreign fruits, strawberries, blueberries. I've heard the Prime Minister speak about it. And they have persons who can't find dunks. When last you saw a sugar apple? When last you had a mammy apple? We are so focused on the ease and access to these foreign niceties with all the nutritional value that we have, that we don't consume what we produce locally, and I echo Senator King and Senator Rogers with their statements in that regard. Now, sir, we do recognize that the trials of modern life means that convenience often trumps ideal food consumption. In other words, sir, listening to Senator King, 30 years ago, would it have been reasonable to expect to buy breakfast on a morning? You wouldn't, but now is the norm. I heard 30 years ago, my cousin likes to tell me that, we had a culture of going to work with a thermos. Yeah. You packed your thermos on a morning and you went to work. Question is, have we now become so successful that we're paying the price for it? Sir, we recognize, and persons will try to frame, that is a drastic change. But persons have to work and to sustain their families, so the convenience and the cost-benefit analysis has to be done. And this is all part of the discussion which we have to encourage. You don't get progress without having discourse and listening to the voices, even if they don't agree with yours. So, sir, coming out of that argument is not only a question of what we consume, but attendant to that is how much we consume. And we need to recognize that the concept of diet and nutrition and teaching it in schools, when we look at, we were taught the food pyramid and you lay on your plate and you put everything like that, the science has moved on. And in terms of portion size and what we consume and how we consume it, all this is part of the narrative that we have to have. So, sir, all these points being stated, all these points being said, points to one: recognition. We recognize the need to have this discussion, and I think we should thank Dr. Braffett for encouraging us to do the same. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Senator Kevin Boyce. Senator Nurse.
Thank you, Mr. President, for affording me the opportunity to participate in this debate on this resolution, which is extremely timely, I think, and I join in the chorus in congratulating Senator Dr. Braffett in bringing such a resolution at this time. Mr. President, the fact is that, we have, and when I say we, I speak more of Barbados, I talk about Barbados and previous administrations, have in the past produced policies which encompass several, if not all of the things that have been debated and spoken about during this debate. As recently as 2015, I believe it was, we would have presented to the FAO a policy paper on agriculture in Barbados and food security. And previous administrations, I dare say, would have done the same. The point is, I'm not suggesting that this resolution and that is not still relevant in that context, but the fact, because since 2015, a lot would have changed, which obviously requires us to pull down those policies, look at them, scrutinize them, and develop them in the context of all that has happened and all that has influenced agriculture within the past few years. We mention would have been made of things like the effect of COVID, the effect of war. We know of the issue with Ukraine and the impact on availability of certain basic items like corn and maize and wheat and so on. We understand that all of these things now have to be examined and analyzed in the context of all of these changes. Added to that, Mr. President, within recent times, we would have had the floods in Pakistan in 22, for example. We would have had issues of drought in parts of Africa and so on, which all of these things which would have impacted on how we must look at our policy going forward. But integral to that policy, Mr. President, and I think I may have raised this point before, is looking at the aspect of our physical development plan and how we understand how we are going to treat agriculture within that plan. The physical development plan, I think it was 2013, mentioned that there was something like 40,000 acres of agricultural land available. The draft plan 2017, which hasn't yet been presented, I can only identify 28,000 acres. So that within that short period of time, Mr. President, we recognize what a substantial portion of our agricultural patrimony has evaporated or gone into other activities. I dare say a majority of it would be in things like housing and so on. And so one of the critical things one of the things we have to do is to, first of all, identify what is going to be a critical mass of agricultural land that is necessary to sustain us in this process of achieving security in food. And I understand, I know that technologies have changed. I know that ways of doing agriculture have changed, which does not necessarily require the large swaths of land that may have been used in agriculture in previous years. I know, for example, hydroponics is a big thing which is now being spoken to. I know that aquacultures and so on can be developed without necessarily the great, huge sizes of land space that we would have utilized in the past. But the point is, there comes to a point where there's going to be that critical mass that is going to be necessary to keep us viable, or to keep an industry and to ensure some level of food security. I don't envisage that and I don't expect, we're never going to be, let's face it, we're never going to be self-sufficient in all of our needs, all of our various foods and so on, but certainly we can do much, much better in terms of producing local produce that can help to ease the burden on our agricultural imports. But, Mr. President, we're not only going to be able to encourage people to get more involved in agriculture unless we can show that it is viable and that it can provide persons with a level of income which will afford them a pretty comfortable standard of living. Just to digress, to give you, to maybe make it a little clear what I'm speaking. I remember in the early 90s, when I was still gainfully employed, and I worked for the firm for which I was connected. I worked in St. Vincent, and I remember in going down to St. Vincent and sort of being taken around and introduced by the local staff in the office. And they drove me along, for example, around the island, and we passed along on the leeward coast. And we looked up into the mountains, and I saw all the greenery. And they said, well, you know, up there, a couple of years ago, all that used to be bananas. But, you know, every week, the farmers would reap their bananas, drive them down in their lorries to Kingston to deliver to the geese boats. And, you know, quite often, because of some little imperfection or something in the fruit, the whole load was rejected and, you know, left the farmer out of pocket. So they said, you know what, that is, they asked me, you know, you recognize what that is, all of that greenery is up there? It wasn't legal then, of course, but subsequent to that, but they said, you know, that is what is now affording all of those farmers up there to make a livelihood and to make a comfortable living. And they had all, he said, and you know, you can see all the buildings and the structures and so on that were going up. And since that time, of course, we have seen how marijuana, albeit medical marijuana, has now become entrenched in a lot of the legislations around the Caribbean. And so I'm suggesting that what needs to happen is to be able to identify the areas of agriculture and things that can be done that can afford our farmers and others who are interested to be able to make a decent living. And there are things, of course, that we will need to be able to do to help them along the way. You know, one of the issues that will prevent agriculture from being as viable as it can be is the issue of the cost of inputs. Unfortunately, we have to import the fertilizers for our crops and so on. We have to import the feeds for the animals, or at least the excuse me, at least the ingredients which go into making the feeds are all imported, the corn and the soy and whatever else. And the point is that within recent times, these products have become so expensive that it's really making it almost impossible for farmers to make anything on their production. I think this is one area where government has got to look at it and to have a policy that we want agriculture to be a significant part, and that we now recognize how important it is to food security. And if necessary, we have to implement subsidies on the various inputs so as to make the overall production more viable. I see, for example, I know, for example, in the US, in other parts of the world, in Europe, particularly European countries, heavily subsidize their farmers. And, you know, when you think about, I mean, I know, for example, in the US, business people actually buy farms because government has provided this level of subsidies and the incentives which make farming a good tax investment. You know, so it's a good vehicle which people use to reduce their taxes. So I am saying that perhaps the time has come where we can look, I'm not saying that we need to mimic everything that is done, but look at these things and recognize that while all of those countries may be talking about, maybe speaking about freeing up trade and not providing subsidies and not doing this and not doing that, in actual fact, are the chief people, are the chief countries where subsidies become a significant and substantial part of agricultural produce. So I think that is another area where we have to, where the government has to look at and decide as part of its policy going forward how it's going to use these incentives and so on to encourage more interest in farming. Another issue I think that needs to be looked at, Mr. President, is the question of the separation of various aspects of agriculture, which fall under various ministries. You now have the Ministry of Agriculture, you have the Ministry of Health, you have the blue economy, you have the green economy. And so there are various aspects that fall under these various ministries, but without any coordination as to ensuring that those aspects which fall under the ministry are being coordinated to see that our overall policy and food security issues are being recognized. And so, Mr. President, these are the things that we would need to put in place to make sure there is some monitoring mechanisms once we have developed what we determine to be our policy going forward, to be able to measure and to make sure that they are being achieved. I was surprised but not shocked to hear Dr. Braffett mention that within the last 5 years, we've only been able to produce 5 agricultural graduates. And I think that is an area where obviously we're going to have to look at and determine how we can get our young people more interested in agriculture. For example, I think we may need to have a development scholarship, for example, a national development scholarship identified as being specific for people interested in agriculture. Maybe giving some other incentives for young people who definitely see this as a a career objective of moving ahead. And, you know, the interesting thing is that years ago, the Ministry of Agriculture was staffed with probably the most qualified technocrats in the civil service. You know, we used to say that there are so many foods in, you know, the Ministry of Agriculture. All the technical people were PhDs. And so we're not probably going to get back to that stage because obviously so many things have turned the young people off of agriculture. But I dare say that if government can provide that kind of policy framework, we may be able to get the number of graduates per year increase to satisfy our requirements for that level of technical expertise and so on. So, Mr. President, what I also want to mention is that we've heard a lot said about and mention made about the fact that we seem to be moving towards the issue not being so much about food, sufficient food available, but the nutritional value of the food available. And perhaps some of it has to do with environment. You know, it is easy for working people, when you leave work, you rush to a fast food outlet and you pick up your dinner for you and your children. So if that is how you are moving forward, and if then it means that we are not creating the environment within the home to encourage our children to have other viable and nutritious foods available. And so, again, we need to look at that area. We need to see how we can educate our children. We need to see how we can change our meal programs provided in the schools, for example, for our students, so that they are geared towards more healthy foods and ensuring that once these things take root, then I think we will solve part of the problem in such a high dependency on non-nutritional value foods. And so, Mr. President, there's a lot of work to be done. Unfortunately, we usually, and administrations, and I'm not blaming this administration or any particular past administration or another, but administrations generally tend to produce these lovely policy documents which are presented at the international forum and so on. And then we come home and, you know, they're put on the shelf and they never implement it. And so if we are going to be really recognizing and becoming now serious, recognizing how the various catastrophes and the pandemics and so on can affect food security, then we need to be serious. We need to see the Ministry of Agriculture not as, you know, it seems not to be able to gain the kind of level of respect and so on that other ministries that are considered to be, you know, the high end, if you like, ministries. And we need to get that idea that agriculture is not important. It's just something we do because, you know, but that we see it as a significant area for the development and for, more importantly, leading to a certain level of food security as we move forward. And so with those few words, Mr. President, I am happy to support this resolution, and I thank Dr. Brathwaite for bringing it to our attention.
Thank you very much, Senator Nurse. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move the suspension of the sitting of the Senate for lunch for a period which will bring us back at 2:45 p.m.
The question is that this sitting be suspended until 2:45 p.m. today. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. The sitting is therefore suspended until 2:45 p.m. today. The sitting is resumed. Senator Tate.
Thank you, Mr. President. This afternoon, sir, I simply want to stand and join my fellow colleagues in the Senate in supporting the resolution that was tabled by Dr. Brathwaite, and to say that I stand in agreement with the sentiments generally of the senators herein, and it's my pleasure to support this resolution. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Tate. Senator Maynard.
Thank you, Mr. President. I too, Mr. President, rise to support this resolution. This private member's bill brought by Senator Brathwaite. Mr. President, Senator Nurse mentioned that we don't follow through on a lot of things, that we spend time and money developing programs, and then we put them in file 13. And when he made that statement, I said to myself, I wonder what he's referring to. He shared a document with me that I would like other members of this chamber to see, because he was referring to a document that was prepared by the then government, and it dealt with food and Nutrition, and was supposed to reach from 2014 to 2018 during the last decade. Now, Mr. President, I was late in coming this morning, but I listened at times to the debate, and I think that all senators who contributed made strong and valid points about food security. Now, the matter of availability, Mr. President, is one thing, but Senator Boyce pointed out that along with the foods being available, they are supposed to be nutritious. So there's no point having lots of grade D of a product that's almost fit for swine, when in fact, what other people are getting are A, B, and C. So the food is supposed to be nutritious. And there's no point having lots of food if the people are not eating it. A lot of the debate centered around agriculture and productivity. But unless you can get the people to eat what you produce, you're wasting time. Senator Thompson spent considerable time at the last sitting speaking about food and the wish that we would go into hotels locally and see our local produce being used to produce exciting dishes that we could enjoy. She stopped short of saying that we should probably do the same in Parliament. But we were surprised today because it looks as though the chef was listening. Now, agriculture in this country, Mr. President, except for those who own the land, meant that you were working for minimum wage. And a lot of people have shied away from agriculture. I don't know if the taxes that are paid by people whose profession is in agriculture are the same as, for example, accountants who work in other areas. But there are countries in which almost everyone who has had a successful career in some area is also registered as a farmer because there are advantages. And if a country is going to be self-sufficient in its food production, it has to encourage those who have the means to do it, to invest in agriculture. And not only through savings on taxes, but with a genuine wish to move the country along. There's also, Mr. President, the question about growing your own food. I think most people in this chamber, well, with a few exceptions, would remember the days when your parents or your grandparents grew some aspect of their food. And those of us who had the privilege of growing up in villages like myself knew the value of a breadfruit tree. And everyone had one. Or if you didn't have one, you had access to breadfruits for free. So we need to come up with a program that encourages people to plant trees, and plant food, not just that will grow in 6 weeks, but at 60 years on will still be producing fruit, Mr. President. Senator Braffett talked about why are we not planting fruit trees and coconut trees in the Scotland district, and he's right. Why is there so much river ptarmigan growing? I listened, well, sorry, I didn't listen. I I saw, Mr. President, on social media, a comment attributed to a minister complaining about tracts of land that were leased for agriculture that were fallow. And it was considered to be a wrong thing to do. I would like to advise that it is important to leave land fallow sometimes. And there are agricultural communities in which you get tariffs, you get paid subsidies for leaving your land fallow. And you get tremendous subsidies for leaving sections of it fallow. There's nothing worse than having a monoculture. You do not want to see all grass or all carrots for miles and miles, because when disaster comes, it will be a disaster. Biodiversity is important. So I'd like to advise her that there are times when you want to leave the land fallow. It has to recover. So I totally disagree that all the land should be worked all the time. You have to leave some fallow. Yes, you need to cycle it. You need to have some fallow and some cultivated and rotate it. But the notion that you will repossess land, sir, because it is fallow is wrong. You have to understand why it's fallow and everything else. And Mr. President, you may have land fallow because the monkeys are eating all your crops and you have no recourse. You might be borrowing money or taking your own money, investing. And at the end of the day, the African monkey is taking your crops, and the other forces that come with trucks are taking them too. So there are lots of reasons why land might be fallow. Now, water, Mr. President, we spoke about agriculture in this country and producing food, but water has always been a problem. Mr. President, and I am thankful and I want to congratulate the government for the efforts it's made to make water available to the small farmers. I seem to have made some people happy, Mr. President. But I am happy too, Mr. President. I too am happy, Mr. President, because a lot of controversy about who controlled the water and whether you could get access to it, especially like now when the rain has stopped falling, a lot of it should be resolved. And when you drive up by Lears, Mr. President, and you see the large agricultural pond, you know that something serious is happening. And I want to again congratulate the government. But we need more, Mr. President. The problems faced by those who practice agriculture and are supposed to produce the food not only for local consumption, but for export, because if we are food sufficient, we should have enough to sell to someone else. Will only be fixed, Mr. President, if you have year-round access to that most important thing, water. You cannot grow food without water. And there is a hint that this government intends to probably bring a water reuse policy. It would be fantastic, Mr. President. There's a hint. People may go to conferences, you can see it. If you go on the internet, you can see it all. You see who attends the conferences. You don't have to come to Parliament to see that. It's there. So, Mr. President, when these things are done, hopefully Senator Braffitt's wish and the wishes of most of us in the Senate, or all of us in the Senate, will come true. But the question of sustainability comes up, Mr. President. Can we sustain it? And can we really produce food that people can sell and make an honest living and not exist at the margins? That a man who is a farmer can buy a condo on the West Coast. And I wish to reiterate, Mr. President, that it should not be that food security and those who farm have to own large tracts of land. Senator Cummings is often referring to tracts of land, Mr. President, that you should be able, with the help of government, to farm and sell from your backyard. So I plead once again, Mr. President, for those who are supposed to make the decisions to really look at technology that will help people who want to farm, and not just farm medical marijuana, Mr. President, not make the rules and concessions for farm medical marijuana, but to allow people to farm and grow healthy food with quick cycles that people can buy at reasonable rates. And the offshoot of that, Mr. President, could be that we might see a drop in our chronic, non-communicable diseases, Mr. President. The health of the nation, Mr. President, is seriously dependent on what we eat. Mr. President, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Leonard. Senator Dr. Monroe Knight.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have promised the leader of government business that I will stay within the time. She has promised that she will put the clock on that, but I know that, Mr. President, you are the ultimate timekeeper, right? And the clock has not started as yet.
In this chamber, my clock is the only one that matters.
Yes, Mr. President. Mr. President, I join with all of the other fellow senators to thank Senator Dr. Charleston Brathwaite for the resolution and also the substantive report that accompanied the resolution. It provides a great opportunity for us to have the level of discussion and discourse that we have had in this chamber to identify both challenges, but also as well a lot of the work that is done in the context of agriculture in Barbados. And certainly the discussion provided points of reflection. I believe that it was Senator Dr. John Rogers who said a lot is being done, Mr. President. And perhaps the reflection for me is perhaps the government needs to do more in terms of touting its own horn at the level of work that it is doing in relation to agriculture. So that is something that we will have to reflect on because much is being done. But not only is much being done by the government, Mr. President, there are a number of initiatives that are being undertaken by citizens across the country in relation to agriculture. You know, it was interesting when we talked about COVID-19 and how that spurred innovation and provided impetus for even the honorable senators here in this chamber, some with brown thumbs, Mr. President, to get involved in agriculture. If you go on Facebook today, and unfortunately I couldn't remember the name of the group, there is a group of Barbadians that came together coming out of COVID that shared information on how to do farming in small spaces. So you had people who were farming grapes that were doing it in little skillets, yes, grapes, not even the dishes barbers, but they were doing grapes and doing other kinds of vegetables in very, very, very small spaces and was sharing that information and creating a community of Barbadians to share that knowledge so that everybody will be able to understand and how to adapt. The other thing, Mr. President, and I don't know again if we notice, but we have had a number of competitions happening within the tourism sector in which, for instance, mixologists have been encouraged to use local plants and fruits and vegetables in their mixes. We have had as well competitions among chefs. There have been private initiatives where you would have online courses or online demonstrations, rather, Mr. President, by chefs again, encouraging Barbadians to use local fruits, local vegetables in their everyday cooking, Mr. President. I even saw, I don't get to watch CBC quite often, but certainly coming on to the end of last year, I remember tuning into a program in which you had a presenter who was actually in the middle of a field, a farm, and then he was actually using the produce of that farm and cooking on site, and then telling everyone about the properties of the food, the importance of it, and how then it can be used within the diet, and the importance of us as Barbadians being able to plant and then use what we grow. Saying all of that, Mr. President, to say is that the government will have its significant role that it has to play. But those things were not spurred or incentivized necessarily by government. It was private citizens taking their individual responsibility and the understanding that they also had a stake and a role to play. And one of the reflections even coming from this discussion was just about how do we catalyze that impetus that has been created to be able to bring the efforts of Barbadians who are aware, who are undertaking their initiatives, the role and importance of the private sector as well, Mr. President, because we haven't necessarily talked about that in a big way. The focus has been largely on what government has to do, what government should do, and how government should provide. But what about the larger role of the private sector, Mr. President? And the extent that they too, in the context of their own markets and their own businesses, also has a responsibility in the context of looking at, one, encouraging Barbadians by creating the markets, by buying the produce, whether they're in supermarkets, whether they're in hotels, etc., and also as well creating that enabling environment that will encourage farmers as well. So the first reflection, Mr. President, is that we need not only to focus on government, but to focus on the extent that all of us and all of the critical stakeholders have a key role to play in this effort. The next thing I want to say, and I probably will start from where Senator Malalu started when he talked about the environment. And in that context, Senator Malalu was talking about the internal environment and the conditions for agriculture here, small land space, and all the other things. But there's another environment that's equally important, which is the international environment, yeah? And I know that in the context of the resolution, we talked about COVID, we talked about supply side constraints. But there's a larger context of how, as a small economy, we have been inserted into the international trade arena. And that itself has also circumscribed the policy space for us in the context of agriculture. Mr. President, you know, when you begin to have this discussion and people will call you, conspiracy theorists and, all of these things, but there are ways in which the international system has worked to make sure that small economies are inserted into the world economies in ways that are not enabling, in ways that ensure that our competitiveness or our lack thereof is further marginalized or further exploited. And certainly in the arena of international trade, we've experienced that. There was trade theory that talked about the whole notion of sunset and sunrise industries, yeah? And in that context, agriculture was seen as part of the sunset industries and services as part of the sunrise industries. And when you had that overarching theoretical framework, that then influences national policy and praxis as well. Because we were encouraged within that context of that theoretical framework to then not prioritize agriculture because agriculture would not yield the results for our economies and to move towards services, tourism, and there was a whole international trade framework built out around the modalities for services to be able to be delivered. We had within the context of the World Trade Organization as well. We talked about that quite a bit over the last couple of weeks as we talked about having to meet standards, meet international standards. But the World Trade Organization essentially provided trade rules that at the very onset, for small economies to be able to meet the standards and meet the requirements were extremely difficult. So we moved from a situation in which we were given preferential access for our bananas, our sugar, our rum to a complete liberalized framework, which now meant that, again, small economies had to then to be able to trade at the same level as bigger economies with greater capacity, greater funding than we did. So that even in the context of rules around things like subsidies, which are extremely important, because within the World Trade Organization framework, Mr. President, we started at the place where, as we know, as small economies, we have to be able to support our sector, support our industries. And within the World Trade Organization, there was a move to circumscribe how countries, nation states, independent nation states, in the context of the World Trade Organization, could provide subsidies. And that created a particular smaller policy space for us as small states. So that within that context, you would see, Mr. President, where there were some subsidies that we were accustomed to providing, that within the context of the WTO, they now call them non-tariff barriers, yeah? And because they were called then non-tariff barriers and placed in a number of different boxes, because the tariffs, the subsidies were identified by different boxes. You had green, you had amber, and different kinds of boxes. It circumscribed what we could apply. But at the same time, you had the same industrialized and developed countries that were telling us about subsidies and about how they should not be applied and how they were trade distorting, were themselves finding ways to circumvent the system and provide subsidies to their own markets and continue to do so at a scale, of course, which we can't. So that we have to make sure that we understand that context as well. Understand what it meant for banana farmers, yeah? To then have to be able to compete now in that international framework, and I talked about it before, Mr. President, when you now had the introduction now of these sanitary and phytosanitary rules that were applied that make that as a farmer, I am accustomed to shipping my bananas, that now these rules were saying one spot and one speckle that they could be refused. And then having to build that capacity over time in order for us to be able to meet the standards. So we did not start, Mr. President, all at the same place. And that is important, so that when we talk about why certain things are in place and why we aren't moving, why we're not exporting enough, that we have to make sure that we have, I think Senator King talked about it, let's have a big, honest discussion about the real challenges that small economies like Barbados face in the context of its agriculture. And I believe I would have said it before, Mr. President, I remember being very intricately involved, again, in the WTO trade negotiations and hearing from myself a negotiator indicating that it is an anachronism of bygone days for small economies to think that they should feed themselves, yeah? To feed themselves, because it would be cheaper for us to be able to import. Theory influencing policy, influencing praxis, Mr. President. So that we operate within the context of that overarching international trade framework that is unfriendly to developing countries. It is through the assistance and work of partners. And Mr. President, I want to recognize AICA, I want to recognize the FAO for the tremendous support that they have given to Barbados and also other countries within the Caribbean to assist them in order to be able to compete to scale, to reform, and ensure that we can adapt to meet the requirements of a modern agricultural system. Mr. President, I want to talk about the innovation that is happening within the agricultural sector. Again, I think that was one of the overarching themes that we heard in the discussion, the need for technology, the need to make sure that we are interesting young people and having a modern agricultural system, and this is also reflected quite broadly within the resolution itself. I want to indicate that the Minister of Agriculture and Food Security had actually publicly indicated that the ministry would be looking to develop an innovation center within the ministry. It was looking to be able to work with a funding partner in order to deliver this innovation center, Mr. President, and that innovation center will be able to, and I'm quoting from the minister, it will be possible to travel through fields planted with crops, manipulate models that simulate the impact on the crops from water, light, and fertilizers as well. The minister also spoke to the development of digital fabrication laboratories as well, which will be created to reduce the digital divide and increase the development of technological solutions, especially in the agricultural, tourism, and agribusiness sectors as well, Mr. President. So a lot is happening in the context of innovation and technology and digitizing as well the business of agriculture. Similarly, Mr. President, in 2021, the government would have signed MOU with a company called Agribusiness. And again, what they specialize is allowing countries to be able to use optimally. We heard a lot about the issue of land space and, how are we going to be able to manage the growth that we need in agriculture given our limited land space and government's land use policy. And again, Mr. President, I want to emphasize that we're thinking about agriculture in traditional ways as well. So we have a contradiction. We're asking for more technology and more modernization, but still thinking that we need to be able to see fields and fields of one particular plant growing when there are so many new ways in order to be able to do farming. There is vertical farming. I remember when I was at the Barbados Medicinal Cannabis Licensing Authority, and our first license was an acre and under. And we couldn't understand, well, we had these large firms that would want to come and have this license for this acre and under. Like, why would you be interested in doing this? And it was because they were applying new ways and new techniques that would allow them within the context even of that small 1 acre to grow using vertical farming, and there were a number of different things that we had to go and research that they could grow optimal size even within that 1 acre. The yield, Mr. President, that they could get. And the government is actually doing that. So the government is actively encouraging container farming, vertical farming as well, in order then that we optimize the land space that we have. So we have to be careful when we talk about we want change in a modern agricultural sector, but also as well we keep thinking of it in the traditional way. The government is seeking to adapt within the context of, yes, we need to be able to look at how we strategically use the land that we have available and use the applicable technologies. On the issue of technology, Mr. President, I want to also indicate that Caribbean Export as well, through their life sciences program, have also taken a technological and digital approach to agriculture. And they have actually identified, and again, somebody was asking, I believe it was Senator King, why are we not using the local plants that we have to scale and then to be able to export? Caribbean Export is actually doing exactly that. Through their life sciences program, they have done analysis, Mr. President, and have, sorry, I'm trying to find the right side of my phone, and they have identified a number of different plants that they will create what we would call or create a ring fence about, and then encourage for further scale in export and also export investment with. So they have identified, Mr. President, aloe vera, sunflowers, coconuts, as well, sweet potatoes, Mr. President, as well, sugarcane, medicinal cannabis. So these are things that have been studied and research and assessments have been undertaken. And Caribbean Export will therefore be creating a system in which we can work with these areas, applying technology, looking at how we can make sure that there is optimal growth, optimal scale as well, working with the farmers and those within the sector in order to make sure that we can build an industry in these areas. So we are taking a strategic approach in relation to agriculture and identifying key plants that we can use and using, again, a technological approach for scale. I want to identify, we've talked a lot, Mr. President, and I agree completely in terms of learning from others and learning from other approaches there. And the discussion, also, again, another point of reflection. Coming out of the resolution itself, which referred a lot to CARICOM, what was happening at CARICOM, and how we need to be able to work together to scale. But also noting as well that CARICOM leaders agreed to agricultural and food security policy 25 by 25. Yeah, so not 30 by 30, but 25 by 25, which is something that Barbados is looking to make sure that it implements. And what that is the identification of particular vegetables and fruits across the region that we can grow to scale in order to replace our imports. And Mr. President, that is happening, and I believe that in the last session, I would have actually listed all of the ones that Barbados in particular identified. I believe it was about 15 or so that we identified specifically that would be part of that 25 by 25 initiative that we will be looking to make sure that, again, we move to scale in order that we can meet that initiative. I also want to identify in the context of climate change and how we are seeking to address the impact of climate change on agriculture through the application of climate smart technologies, Mr. President. So that we know that in the context of Barbados, agriculture and forestry only contribute 3% of the total emissions. Yeah, 3%. And that can be ignored. But the government is so ambitious, Mr. President, that within the context of our nationally determined contribution, our NDCs, and this is what we signal internationally as the targets that we will meet in the context of climate change mitigation. For Barbados, we have identified specifically for agriculture, increased multi-cropping, zero-till, and other best management practices to reduce emissions from agriculture. I hope that the Honourable Chamber would note that the government launched a tree planting, I think including is the million trees planted, a million trees project, Mr. President. And that, again, is twofold. One, in terms of allowing us to address the critical issue, again, of food security, because we're not just planting any old crops, but we're being very strategic about those ones that we see that are either missing or not fully in production in order to be able to plant those trees throughout the country. And not only that, we are strategically as well, Mr. President, involving school children, the 4-H clubs, in that initiative in order as well to make sure that we don't still that notion of the importance of agriculture and an understanding of why we're planting these million trees, Mr. President. And even though that may seem to be a small thing, it is substantial. The Ministry of Agriculture as well has noted the importance of making sure that we inculcate within our schools, again, putting together the notion or the challenge of healthy eating, dealing with the issue of obesity, as well as making sure that we can have our children understanding the importance of agriculture, have been encouraging schools to take up agricultural projects. And, Mr. President, we note that the government is to receive a number of shade houses from the government of Guyana under the agreement that we have, and the ministry has indicated that a large portion of those will go to schools across Barbados in order to encourage production from within primary, Mr. President, and secondary schools. Yeah? I want to note as well, Mr. President, that we talked a lot about nutrition and nutritious food and making sure that people have access to good quality food. And again, I want to identify that particularly the Ministry of Health, the minister have just recently announced that by 2024, Barbados will be looking to have legislation to eliminate trans fat, from food. We note as well that the Ministry of Education has enunciated a nutrition policy for schools to, again, to encourage healthy eating amongst our school children. So not only agriculture, because if we identify just the role of agriculture, then we've only just touched one part of the challenge. But we've gone further and brought to bear all of the critical ministries that are going to be important in this process. So the Ministry of Health in terms of doing that part, and then as well the Ministry of Education as well, Mr. President, so that we are creating a full nexus within that context of how we address the issue of obesity, making sure that there's nutritious food, making sure that there's an understanding of why we need to be able to have nutritious food and all of those things. I want to note, Mr. President, and I'll wrap up very quickly, that while I was here, I went on the Government Information Service site, I went on the Ministry of Agriculture site, and one of the first things that came up, I put in garden farming. And there was a full tutorial that was there that took you through all of the steps and asked the questions, do you want to start a small garden? This is what you have to be able to do. I want to also identify, as been indicated, that outside of the feed program, which I want to indicate provides training, so it's not just about giving the land, but it provides financial training, it provides the scientific training, it provides all the training for you to understand the business of the agriculture as well. So everyone that goes through the feed program, I can start you out, Senator Drakes. Everyone that goes through the feed program, your first step is you have to go through that training. So it builds capacity for you, Mr. President. So we're not just saying, go take the land, but we are making sure that you understand how to be successful within that context. And the government has also as well enunciated a program to encourage backyard farming and actually providing inputs to support that backyard farming, Mr. President. So I'm hoping that we are getting the sense, again, I go back to Senator Dr. Rogers, that a lot is being done. A lot is being done. It may not always be perfect, but a lot of initiatives are being done. The ministry is being extremely careful in the context of its approach to agriculture and building out the sector. And Mr. President, I could go on to several things about initiatives that will actually strengthen the ministry itself through projects with AICA as well. I could go on to talk about the regional collaborations that I've spoken about that's happening with Suriname and happening with Guyana. So tells us that we understand that we have to make linkages to look to bigger countries that have scale that we can export and we can get inputs from as well, demonstrating as well, again, that notion of being able to build scale. I could point, Mr. President, to the work that we will be undertaking with CARDI, which is the Caribbean Institution for Agriculture. And one of the things that we'll be doing under CARDI is germplasm. Again, and under CARDI, there is a plan to make Barbados the center of excellence for small ruminants. So that, Mr. President, there is much work being done. And again, I say that perhaps we need to shout a little bit harder, but at times when you shout a little bit harder, then you're accused of, showing off and all of this. But the government is getting on with the work of producing. Mr. President, I can point to the number of workshops that the Ministry of Agriculture has had, even in the area, and I spoke to it last week, of making sure that people know how to produce natural pesticides, right? Organic pesticides. Workshops, again, so that farmers are exposed to how to apply technology, the efforts at renewable energy, the efforts to make sure that they are using different kinds of techniques, Mr. President, in the context of their farming. I remember it had to be like about 10 years ago under a project. We were working with a particular farm to look again at water management, to look at issues of how they will be able to account for the fertilizers that was being used and having a system to be able to measure so they could measure their inputs and how it would help them to reduce their light bill. All of these initiatives are being undertaken. As I close, Mr. President, again, I want to thank Senator Dr. Charleston Brathwaite for the resolution and for providing, as I said before, space for this conversation. But I also want to highlight that the government is paying attention to agriculture. And Mr. President, again, I am hamstrung by the time, but every time I want to start, I'll find another initiative, because I could talk about the support that we have given, the millions of dollars that we have provided in support for the poultry sector. I could talk about that when we talk about the fact that government isn't prioritizing agriculture, Mr. President. So that the government is taking a strategic approach. The last thing I would say, Mr. President, is where I started, and again last week, transformation takes time. We have to decide as a society whether we only want quick wins, whether we only want the things that can be delivered immediately, or whether or not we will be able to appreciate that investment takes time to produce fruit. And that fruit may not be delivered in the context of one administration, but that the seeds that are planted by one administration will then rebound to the benefit of this nation. And that, Mr. President, is the process of transformation that this government is about in the context of agriculture. I'm obliged.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Monroe Knight. Senator Dr. Brathwaite, I invite you to wrap up the debate.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And let me say how pleased I am to have the opportunity to respond. Let me begin by thanking all my fellow senators for the very valuable contributions that they have made to this debate today, and to say that I'm very pleased to hear the seriousness with which they have taken this issue, as clearly the issue is not an agricultural issue. This is an issue about development. This is an issue about international trade. This is an issue about technology. This is an issue about modernization. And this is an issue about the future of our country. I would like to say that I brought this motion to the Senate because of my concern for the area of food security within the context of the global reality. Coming out of COVID, and we're not out yet, and given the war in Ukraine and the challenge of climate change, clearly food security is something that we have to take very seriously. In fact, Mr. President, in addition to climate change, food insecurity represents a significant threat to our development going forward unless we take appropriate action to treat with this issue. And I will tell you why. My resolution was never designed to negate or belittle the important work that is being done by the Mia Mottley administration and the Minister of Agriculture, the Honorable Inda Weir, and his team. Because in a real sense, I view the work that is being done by this administration as the establishment of a secure base, a foundation, a platform, if you will, to treat with the issue of food security in Barbados. And I have said before, and I will say it again, that the work that is being done by the administration, in my view, represents the greatest political advance in the area of food security that has been taken since 1945, when the Director of Agriculture, Mr. John Saint, mandated that all plantations in this fair land produce food from 12% of their lands. And so the work that has been presented by Senator Monroe Knight is significant. It represents a platform for the future. Agriculture, in a real sense, is not a now-for-now initiative. This is long-term strategy because things take time to mature. And those who do not understand the reality of the sector must come to realize that patience is critical in success in agriculture. I seek to bring the attention of the Chamber and to the people of Barbados the seriousness of a dependence on foreign supplies of food and the threat of continuous food insecurity. But let me respond by making reference to a question posed by our Deputy President when she made her presentation in the last meeting of the Senate. And she said in her presentation, Senator Elizabeth Thompson said, I wonder what it will take to achieve food and nutrition security in Barbados. That's a question she posed in her presentation. What will it take? And I thought that I would respond to that key question, because I think in answering that key question, we begin to realize what will it take for Barbados to become food secure. And in saying so, I understand very clearly, it doesn't mean produce all that you consume, but it means being more food secure so that you are not dependent on the rest of the world to feed you. And I came to the conclusion there are 5 things that it will take. It will take a nation working together who are convinced that as we seek to build a modern Barbados and a modern economy based on political and economic independence, it is not in our strategic interest to depend on the rest of the world to feed us. It is not in our interest. Number 2, it will take a nation working together who agree that you cannot allow your fertile lands to be covered in River Tamarind and Kowich while you continue to import $700 million of food. It is not in your interest. Thirdly, It will take a nation working together to recognize that one of the most critical challenges of our time is to provide food for an increasing world population of 8 billion people. And that in fact, with climate change and the shortage of arable land, there is the great possibility that there will be great food shortages in the future globally. If that is so, any country should be seeking to strengthen its food security. And if you look around the world today, you will find that many countries are stepping up to the plate because they visualize the challenge that is coming. It will take a nation that is aware that we cannot depend for our survival on tourism alone. We cannot. And the diversification of this economy is fundamental to our survival. Because, Mr. President, when the tourists do not come, as we experienced during COVID, we suffer significant financial burdens. And in that context, it will take awareness in our nation today that the Barbados population is reported to have one of the highest levels of chronic non-communicable diseases in the Americas. It is recognized that by many that this high incidence of cancer, obesity, hypertension, high blood pressure, heart disease, and diabetes is due mainly to the consumption of high levels of imported processed foods that are high in salt, sugar, saturated and unsaturated fats. Medical records show that 8 out of every 10 deaths in Barbados are due to NCDs. Nutritional evidence demonstrates that the consumption of more fresh fish, ground provisions, fruit and vegetables can assist in reducing the incidence of these diseases. The consumption of these products will result in a reduction in the healthcare bill and increased life expectancy. A recent report indicated that 43% of all the beds in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital are occupied by people suffering from diabetes. Medical professionals around the Caribbean are warning that the importation and consumption of imported processed foods are contributing to rising levels of obesity, especially among children. I am told by a recent colleague that the cost of health care in Barbados moved from $167 million to $486 million in 15 years, a 150% increase in the health care bill. The question then, Mr. President, is this sustainable? And if in fact we can reduce the health care bill by producing and consuming healthier food, is it not in our strategic interest to do so? At the operational level, while it is true that significant progress has been made, we need to put more resources into the Ministry of Agriculture and Food Security. We need to recognize that the provision of highly trained professionals, appropriate legislative framework, and respect and support for farmers is important. We need to give priority to support to our farmers in Barbados and less support to farmers in distant lands. If we analyze the food import bill, that's $700 million, we'll realize how many farmers in distant lands that we are supporting and their families in distant lands. But farmers in this country, we're not doing enough for them. We must remember that this land was a jewel in the crown of the British Empire, not because we possess gold or we possess oil, but because of our agricultural resources. In 1957, this country produced 200,000 tons of sugar. This little country for the British. Today we produce 10,000, if so much. And there are those who tell us we can't feed ourselves, in spite of the fact that the agricultural resources of this country was a jewel in the crown of the British Empire. Mr. President, I believe that those who import the $700 million of food into this country, and those who benefit from the importation of such a significant amount of food, I believe that they sing a song. To me, they sing a song that has 5 verses. The first verse says, "You're too small to feed yourself." The second verse says, "You are too inefficient and uncompetitive to feed yourself." The third verse says, "You are too water scarce to feed yourself." The fourth verse says, "You had slavery, and therefore you can't feed yourself." And the fifth verse says, "Sell your land to the highest bidder for real estate, golf courses, and hotels, and continue to import food." Mr. President, the time has come to sing a new song. And that song must say that in this land, which was a jewel in the crown of the colonial masters, can produce a substantial proportion of the food that we need if we apply ourselves to the task, and if we develop a modern agricultural sector based on scientific and technological advances that are available today. And some of those advances have been mentioned earlier, and I would like to inform that there are more that can be applied. We can have a modern sector if we train and support our farmers. We can produce competent extension officers, agricultural economists, irrigation engineers, food safety specialists, certified crop advisors, agricultural machine operators, post-harvest specialists, veterinarians, plant pathologists, entomologists, greenhouse managers, and others. We can have a modern agricultural sector if we apply the principles of precision agriculture, mechanization of production, agricultural insurance, vertical farming, biotechnology, genetics, hydroponics, aquaponics, food processing technologies, and if we commit to a renewal of our soils which were exploited. If we explore the economic potential of the Barbados cherry, if we explore the economic potential of Barbados black-belly lamb, if we explore the economic potential of Barbados Sea Island cotton, if we explore the economic potential of the Barbados grapefruit, if we explore the economic potential of Barbados flying fish, and if we use these and others as the basis for local consumption and and possibly for export in food production industries. Mr. President, it's important to recognize that agriculture is not about farming and farming alone. In fact, the analysis shows that farming is only 25% of agriculture. 15% of the economic activity in agriculture comes from input suppliers, and 60% comes from agro-industry. In other words, after you've produced the product, the processing, the distribution, the transport, the storage, the labeling, all of these are jobs. And that is why the developed countries will never stop subsidizing agriculture. Because in subsidizing agriculture, they subsidize a significant part of their economy. And then they tell us, don't apply subsidies. Dr. Monroe Knight is right. The conditions of the WTO and the trade liberalization regimes were not in the interest of small developing countries. And we need to understand these things, because if we don't understand them, we'll continue to sing the song of those who support the food import bill. We need to understand a reality that we have to remove the colonial legacy that tell us we cannot feed ourselves. That's a colonial legacy. I would encourage the government and the Ministry of Agriculture to continue the worthy efforts that they are making to dismantle the colonial thinking and the colonial structures that continue to inhibit us from moving forward. We will not be able to move forward if we keep those colonial structures in place that tell us we can't. We can do much better. I call on our farmers to take agriculture more seriously and to run their farms as a business. I call on the university to do more research and training to help us become modern in our efforts. I call on tourism to establish linkage between agriculture and tourism, and let the people who visit our shores partake of the local products. They don't come here to eat beef from where they came. They would like to taste Barbados black belly lamb. They would like to sample what we have here that is different. Let us promote it, and therefore promote our economy, and at the same time support our farmers. I call on Barbadians as citizens and consumers to join the journey to national food security by buying more locally produced food, thus supporting our farmers, developing community gardens and backyard gardens for local food production, avoiding the consumption of processed foods and ready-to-serve meals that are rich in trans fats, saturated fat, salt, and sugars. And I call on the press, the communication media, the church, to give priority in their messages to the people of Barbados that the consumption of healthy local food is good for health and long life and for the progress of this nation. Mr. President, the Senate on Barbados is asked to recognize that these are not ordinary times. As we seek to build a new modern society and a modern economy after COVID and after the war, reducing our food insecurity should be a priority. When you promote food insecurity, you develop your economy. This is not all about food. It is about economic development. Failure to achieve the goal of reducing the food import bill by 25% by 2025 could result in higher food prices, hunger, starvation, and an uncertain economic future. Mr. President, I quote from the late Calypsonian, the Black Stallion, "We can make it if we try a little harder." Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Dr. Bradford. Could you move the passing of the resolution, please?
Mr. President, I move that the resolution be passed. And I thank all senators for their contributions.
And
Mr. President, I'd like to second it.
Thank you. And before putting the question, I would just like to associate myself with the remarks made by honorable senators. It was a very rich debate, and to congratulate Senator Dr. Braffett for moving the resolution and also for the production, for sharing this with us, a copy of the 2012 proposal, this rich reading, and certainly look forward to the updating of it and bringing it into policy. The question is that this resolution do not pass. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it. This resolution is no passed. Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number one, in the name of the honorable leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the final appropriation 2021-22 bill 2022.
Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. This is a requirement by way of our legislation. We approve in the other place and in this place the annual appropriation bill, and any supplementary resources are required by law to be laid in the other place without a vote and then approved by this place without a vote. On that basis, Mr. President, I beg to move the second reading of the appropriations bill, the final appropriation bill 2021 to 2022.
The question is that this, let's make sure I have the order right, that the final appropriation 2021-2022 bill be read a second time. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that the Senate now dissolve itself into committee for further deliberation of this bill.
The question is that I do now leave the chair and the Honorable Senate resolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say nay. The ayes have it.
Members of the Senate, normally when money bills, the certified go into that's why we're going to clause 1.
Because if the appropriation bill was passed last year, so if you remember, these were supplementaries.
Madam Chair, before I would have mentioned to you, but this is the final appropriation bill, and it's been certified as a money bill. And under our rules, a money bill does not go into committee. And we will go straight to third reading. But because there's an amendment to be made to clause 1, because it has 2022, and obviously we're in year 2023. So that's the only reason we are actually going into committee, so we can make the amendment to the clause. But ordinarily, this would have gone straight from second reading, right to third reading, and then passing in second. So clause 1.
So I thank the Clerk of Parliament for his explanation, as much to members who were a little puzzled over what was happening as to the general public, some of whom pay very close attention to these proceedings and to the processes to ensure that proper rules are being observed. So I think that we are all now clear that this is not a debate, but we will merely be making an amendment that is essential, changing the date from 2022 to 2023. And with that, clause 1.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that clause 1 as amended. Do not do stand part.
The question is that clause 1, give me the title.
You're just changing the year. 2023. No, it's,
No, 23.
it's
Bill, the
2021,
title of the
2020, but the
23.
bill is year 2023.
The question is that clause 1 as amended in terms of the date do now stand part. All those members in favor, all those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Ma'am, just for clarity, the appropriation bill is for the year 2021 to 2022, but the bill itself is of 2023. Just to be clear that way. Clause 2.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that clause 2 don't stand part.
The question is that clause 2 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Clause 3.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that clause 3 stand part.
The question is that clause 3 do now stand part. Would all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you say no, please? The ayes have it.
Clause 4.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that clause 4 stand part.
The question is that clause 4 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
The schedule.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that the schedule be the schedule to the bill.
The question is that the schedule be now the schedule to the bill. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Report.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that you do not report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee. Will all, with amendment, will all those honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against, please say no. The ayes.
The chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee with amendment. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a third time.
Question is that this bill be read a third time. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The thing the ayes have it. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as a final appropriation 2021-2022 Act 2023.
The question is that this bill do not pass and be cited as the final appropriation 2021-2022 Act 2023. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say nay. The ayes have it. This bill is now passed and so cited. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, today has actually been a brilliant day. The debate has been robust and full, and I have thoroughly enjoyed the contributions of all honorable members of the Senate. I wish to join my colleague senators in congratulating our colleague, Dr. Charleston Brathwaite, for an excellent private members resolution, and of course, all of our colleagues who contributed to the same. This brings us today to the end of government's business, and I beg to move that the Senate be adjourned until next Wednesday at 11 a.m. February 15th at 11 a.m.
The question is that the Honorable Senate be adjourned until Wednesday, February 15th at 11 a.m. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Let me, as we will not be meeting until after Valentine's Day, let me wish you a very wonderful Tuesday. I will come forgetting all of that on Wednesday, come to work. But I wish everyone a wonderful season of love. You can treat it as a weekend of love. So have a happy Valentine's weekend, folks. And thank you very much. This sitting of the Senate is adjourned.